Claire Miller is the CEO of the New South Wales Irrigators Council, and we're on the hunt to find this gap in water recovery that Water Minister Tanya Plibersek's talking about. Thanks for joining us, Claire.
No worries. Thanks very much for having me on again, Ricky.
Well, look, we were looking at this, and you've come to the fore with some information that's come through to our studios about this gap in water recovery that the Federal Water Minister in the Murray-Darling Basin, Tanya Plibersek, is talking about. Where are they actually saying in terms of which particular catchments, first of all, they're saying they need to recover this water?
So the catchments are the New South Wales Murray Valley, the Lachlan Valley, the Namoy Valley, border rivers, New South Wales border rivers, I should say, the Barwon-Darling, and then up in Queensland in the Condamine Belong system. And so what you've got is you've got the model that spat out a water recovery number more than a decade ago and said these are the volumes that were estimated that needed to be recovered in order to meet sustainable diversion limits under the Basin Plan. So these 5 or 6 valleys are deemed to still be under-recovered. They haven't quite sort of hit that target that the model says is needed to reach to meet the sustainable diversion limits. The thing is, under sustainable diversion accounting that we've had in since 2019, and consistent with the old cap accounting for 20 years before that, it's very clear that these valleys and others right across the whole basin, they're already meeting the sustainable diversion limit. So we know from implementation, we know from accounting, since that model made an estimate more than 10 years ago, that in fact the sustainable diversion limits have already been met right across the basin. And in fact, underusage is more of an issue, particularly in the New South Wales Murray. So our sort of question is, well, what gap are you actually bridging?
Well, this was what seemed odd to us when the Minister popped up and said we were going to bridge a gap in recovery under sustainable diversion limits. It did seem to come very close after the Basin Authority had been critical of New South Wales's progress in terms of water recovery. Do you get a sense it was maybe a little bit of punishment under the spin of a gap for New South Wales's slow progress?
No, I don't think it was that. I think it's that, the Basin Plan sort of runs on these sort of railway tracks. It was put out, as I say, more than 10 years ago. It's a very narrowly cast plan, and it was based on a model, and it's like your bureaucracies and so forth. It's just the Basin Plan says we have to do this, and doesn't matter that we've had more than 40 reviews over the last 10 years, all of which have looked at implementation, looked at the lessons that we've learnt, what we've learnt by doing, and have made lots of recommendations on deviating from that path based on new knowledge, better understanding, including the Productivity Commission in 2018. But somehow the bureaucracies just don't deviate, and I think this is just an example of that.
So just to be clear, you've gone over each of these valleys, and well, in your estimation, there is just no justification for further recovery in any of those valleys?
No, not in all of them. There's a couple, the Namoy and the border rivers, where the annual water use was a bit over the sustainable diversion limit last year, but it's a system of overs and unders, and they were well under the year before. So, one sort of cancels out the other. The way that the SDLs work for compliance, by the way, is each valley has a sustainable diversion limit. And then what happens in any given year, because you get wet years and dry years, obviously, so in dry years you can't use up to that amount, is that they have a model and it determines, okay, here's the annual permitted take, which reflects if it's very wet, you can take more. If it's very dry, obviously your permitted take is much lower. And then they match that against the annual actual take. So, and then in the long term, that should average out at the SDL. But you do have overs and unders each year. That's absolutely normal part of the accounting, and it's in the Basin Plan and set out how they do it. So as I say, we've got, we had 20 years of cap accounting, and all of these valleys were accumulating credits. They were all under consistently the cap. Those credits were all wiped, and they started from zero again in 2019 with the sustainable diversion limits, which are lower under the Basin Plan coming in, and yet they're still meeting them, except they're under them. So I would argue even in those two valleys where you have 1 year of a little bit of an over, it would be much too early to tell whether that's going to be a chronic pattern or not. And certainly the history before then under cap accounting for 20 years was that they were consistently under anyway.
Now, Claire, you're speaking as the CEO of the New South Wales Irrigators Council, but I gather you've gone and forensically looked at every valley in the basin plan, including in other states. Were there any others in your estimation that were under or over, or was everyone in the basin pretty much in the same territory as the New South Wales ones you're talking about?
Yes, all of the valleys across the basin are compliant with the sustainable diversion limits right across the whole basin. I mean, these are reports that the MDBA puts out. The one exception was in the Murray-Darling, but in both years of SDL accounting, both the MDBA and the department was very clear that what's been 2 over years is due to a persistent modelling issue. And they've been very clear it's not over-extraction, it's not the farmers using any more than they're allowed to, in fact the opposite. I just wish they'd actually get that particularly long-term modelling issue sorted, because it does distort people's sort of understanding of what's happening out there. But yes, basically the valleys across the basin are under SDL.
And I guess lastly, when the Minister popped up and talked about this gap, had there been any commentary from any source, the Minister, any independent authority or otherwise, that there was a gap?
They have simply gone with the original model that said you need to recover this much water from each of these valleys to meet their STLs, and that's what they're doing. So we've got these 5 or 6 valleys that on paper, according to the model, need some more water recovered. And we're saying, no, wait a minute, the whole point of the basin plan was to establish sustainable diversion limits and then make sure that water diversions were pulled down to meet that. And that's what we're already doing. So buybacks and any kind of water recovery are simply the means to that end. They're not the whole point of the exercise. So we just say, well, take a look here. Do you actually need to bridge the gap? Do you need to cause this additional uncertainty and disruption and angst in these communities with another round of open buybacks that probably aren't needed?
Well, and I guess that brings me to that point about a recent meeting that I think it was happening in Deniliquin, and locals got very little notice about it. It did appear to be a very selective audience of who they wanted to hear from about buybacks. Have you had any feedback from your members about these consultation meetings about the buyback process?
Yes, and those meetings did take place in all of the valleys that are deemed to be under-recovered. That's the only place where these open buyback tenders are occurring. And look, all of our members in all of those valleys were really unhappy that the government had come out and just said, they had been saying, the government, look, all options are on the table for water recovery. Buyback, you have flagged buybacks would or could be part of the mix. But then when push came to shove, the first thing that gets released with no forewarning at all, not for even the other states, by the way, for any of the basin states, was the buyback package alone. That was it. And it was just felt that didn't bode very well then for whether other options will be on the table for, there's a much bigger part of the basin plan implementation that still needs to occur, and that's called the Sustainable Diversion Limit Adjustment Mechanism, SIDLAM. It just created fear that maybe other options weren't seriously on the table. What I can say, though, is that we have, again, had assurances that the government and certainly Victoria and New South Wales, that they're serious about looking at other options that don't involve taking more water out of the pool for the SIDLAM. So we can only continue to work with them and take that in good faith that they're genuine about it, and we'll sort of see where the proof is in the pudding at the next ministerial council on that front. But it did just, having those buybacks come out, it brings back very bad memories for people of the pretty brutal rounds for years of buyback tenders back in, on the decade ago. It's taken those communities this last 10 years to adjust to the socio-economic impact of, that bigger reduction in water available for irrigation, particularly in drought years, to survive them. So it's just a shiver of fear down people's spine that, oh my God, are we back there again? We've only just got ourselves kind of back on an equilibrium here and managing, and they're going to do it to us again. So as I say, at the moment we're trusting that they are genuine in saying, no, all other options are on the table and will be explored thoroughly.
Well, on the Saturday we had the state election where the Minns government was incoming. He was sworn in as Premier on Tuesday. Rose Jackson, the Shadow, told us just before the election that she saw buybacks as an absolute last resort. What's your organisations for the New South Wales Irrigators Council reaction to the state election result?
Look, we're a non-partisan organisation, obviously, and we have good relationships across the political spectrum, including, obviously, with the Labor Party. And Ms Jackson had said to us during the campaign, she regarded buybacks as being an absolute last resort, and that she wanted to see all other options being explored, and was looking for more flexibility so that you can actually bring new projects into the basin plan, which currently it doesn't allow for, and also an extension of time to allow those projects to be completed. So we look forward to working with the new government towards that objective.
Well, Claire, thanks so much for being generous with your time today. We've gone hunting for this gap, and in some ways we can see it's somewhere based in the past and maybe but not based on recent research. We look forward to finding out more from the Water Minister when she finally talks to us, Tanya Plibersek. Thanks for joining us.
No worries. Thanks very much, Ricky.